Okay, welcome to today's lecture on American poetry. The first poet we're going to be looking at in this class is Walt Whitman. A few things to keep in mind when we do the readings of his poems. One is the idea of the sublime. So you might want to take a note of that word, sublime. Um, uh, and this is kind of this term was introduced in the poetic context in this course with the work of Shelley earlier on. Remember, in the Romantics, Shelley believed that the sublime abandonment or engagement with the sublime, or a kind of feeling of the sublime, made it easier to overcome more earthly sort of pleasures. So we could sort of substitute sort of lower pleasures for higher pleasures that we found in sublime engagement with the world. And Whitman takes this up in many ways, this idea of finding the sublime in everything. So in one sense, there's a profound religious aspect to Whitman's poetry, and a profound sort of sense of American spirituality coming through in his poetry. One thing you notice, well, yeah, and on that note, that one theme that constantly recurs, you might note, is kind of a opposition or to finalities, to death as being the final word in a sense. So there's a profoundly religious core to his work. And one aspect of finding the sublime in the everyday with Whitman that needs to be noted is the way he made certain everyday themes of working class, of domesticity, of the house, of the railroads, all these sort of things. Bless you. All these sort of things that traditionally weren't the topic of traditional poetry. He made them subjects of traditional poetry. So he's engaging with so there's a highly realistic aspect to his poem. He's engaging with the horrors, often the horrors, but also the at one level he's engaging with the horrors of day-to-day existence, and trying to find a way to enter in through that, pass through that into something sublime. And in another sense, he's trying to open our eyes to having a sense of sublime in the current moment, by enjoying the things around us in a sort of almost a meditative sort of way. So there's almost a Buddhist aspect to his thought that comes off, Eastern spirituality coming out. The idea of being able to meditate and lose yourself in the contemplation of things like grass, the wind, these sort of things. So there's those two aspects, those aspects of his thought. And that kind of, so what he's doing, he's coming down to the real gritty reality of colonial American life in its most grittiness, and then trying to find some way to break through that and elevate to a higher realm. And one way he does that is through, often, linguistically, note the language. He often uses, if you know a thing or two about English language is composed of both Anglo-Saxon components as well as Latinate or more French-inspired words. So a simple example of that is when we talk about cows, we use the Anglo-Saxon. When we talk about food, we use beef, which derives from the French, the Norman word. So some words in English language, often you could use a simple Anglo-Saxon word or simple word, or more fancy sort of Latinate or French-sounding word. And these days we don't notice it because all the words are mixed together in the English language, but they are discernible. Often he'll pick the simple word but against the pretentious. And he'll often introduce American slang. as well. So you have American slang coming into the context, American colloquialism. So it's not sort of high language. It's everyday language. It's language rooted in the people. So in that sense, that's another thing to note. Uh, Another technical point is that in earlier poems we had to look a lot at rhyme and meter and cadence and all this sort of thing. So forget your pentameters and iambs and all this sort of thing, because now what Whitman does, he throws all that formal structuring out altogether, and now what you get is kind of rhyme, meter, all of that's thrown out. So that in that sense, it can be harder to approach first on if you're used to expecting that kind of a regular rhyme scheme. And along as well as that, you notice he has very long sentences. And that creates challenges in itself, because now you have to read these long sentences. And what do you do about breath? Pausing. So that the idea of something simple like having long sentences itself is a technical problem that needs to be overcome. So it's not like he's being sloppy and just like, oh, I'll just get rid of this and just write long sentences. I'll just get rid of the rhyme scheme and just write long sentences. No, writing long sentences without a rhyme scheme, without iambs, kind of creates problems of itself. And one of them is like, where do you hold your breath? Where do you take a new breath? Where do you pause? And that's part of that breaking down of the formal rules, getting closer to everyday speech, getting closer to natural speech. So in terms of that, when you read, I think and this is why it's quite difficult for young people to read, because he requires a bit of quiet and slowness because you have to try and delve into the text and try and imagine his voice and where a natural pausing would occur. So there's a whole different rhythm, and a rhythm often is quite difficult for younger people to get into, this sort of slowness. There is a real slowness to his work. So these are kind of technical points that we need to that may help you to delve into the poems effectively, noting these sort of things. We don't look at his most famous work, which is Leaves of Grass. Has anyone looked at that? Or well, basically, his last work was a book of poems called Leaves of Grass. And even just the title, Leaves and Grass, there's a kind of paradox in that. The idea of leaves which fall represent death, decay, and grass which comes up from above. So he's kind of like playing with that idea. So grass has a very powerfully symbolic place in Whitman's poems. So pay attention to that. So keep. I think a good way of starting to read Whitman is by almost circling or taking note of the objects and the symbolic, and trying to unpack the symbolic power that he gives to them. I think he's a poet that works really well for the Australian context as well, given our sort of also colonial, rural type of context that we live in Queensland as well. It's a poetry that really is suited to being read outdoors by yourself, sitting out in nature on the grass. So I think those are the main technical points I would like to make before we break into groups and start getting into these texts.